But the point then is that we bring certain, as it were, predispositions to bear, and only what fits into those predispositions can be experienced for us.
That's absolutely right, yes.
And this was something, the nature of which I think had not occurred to any philosopher before.
No, genuinely novel, I think, yes.
Now, what sort of entirely novel view of the nature of human knowledge did this begin to lead him towards?
Well, he put forward the claim that if one sort of thought carefully enough and argued long enough, one could specify what he called the form of any possible experience. This he gave the name of this the metaphysic of nature, or sometimes the metaphysic of experience to this enterprise. What he called the matter, that was a contingent matter. It might be this or that actually happened. But he thought one could spell out and think out what the form, as he called it, of any possible experience must be. And this would be a body of doctrine that would tell you something about the world, of course, because it's telling you what its essential form is, but telling you something necessary. It couldn't be otherwise.
And for this, and because there are such propositions, that was why Hume and others of his predecessors were wrong in analyzing all possible propositions into either analytic, which would be true or false by nature of the terms used, and synthetic, or a posteriori, which were true or false according to observation and experience.
Yes.
We've now got a third kind.
Yes.
Yes. Now, can you give us an example or two of concepts or propositions which are of this sort?
Well, putting it in the most general terms, they divide into two broad classes. First of all, Kant tried to deal with what he called the form of sensibility or perception. And he thought that here one could spell out and work out the fundamental character of space and time. He thought these were imposed upon our experience by the nature of our sensibility.
I want to stop you there, because I think this is a very hard idea for people to grasp, to whom it's new.
Yes.
He was saying that space and time don't characterize things as they are in themselves.
Yes, indeed.
But are inescapable modes of experience for us.
That's right.
That we can only experience things in these dimensions.
Yes.
But independently of our experience, these dimensions can't be said to exist.
That's certainly right. I mean, he would say, if somebody said, well, what about the creation as it is in itself? What kind of spatial and temporal order does it display? Kant would say, not a discussable topic. And all we can talk about is that world which is an object of experience to us, the world as it appears. And he thought that here, it's very arguable whether he was right to have this thought, but he thought that in thus bringing in space and time as forms of sensibility, he was in effect bringing in geometry and arithmetic, amazing, odd play. He thought that geometry and arithmetic dealt with forms of sensibility and were bodies of synthetic a priori truth for that reason.
Given that he says that there are propositions of this special kind which apply to the world but are not derived from experience.
Yes. Could I just intervene?
Yes.
I was going to say that his synthetic a priori proposition divides into two broad classes. We've only dealt with one of them, of course.
Yes.
If I could just very briefly bring in the second.
Right.
He thought that there are also what he called forms of the understanding, in a sense, forms of thought. And I suppose the fundamental principles which he tried to show were conditions of the possibility of understanding would be, first of all, the principle of universal causal determinism, which he thought was one of them. And then, rather unplausibly, he also tries to show that Newton's law of the conservation of matter states a condition of the possibility of experience too.
Now, in order to arrive at the sort of total picture that we're beginning to build up, let me just recapitulate up to this point. That Kant is saying that because all of our knowledge and experience comes to us through our sensory and mental apparatus, it all comes to us in forms which are sense-dependent and mind-dependent.
Yes.
And that we have no direct access to things as they are in themselves, independently of all possible experience. Now, given that the modes of apprehension that we have are whatever they are, possible experience must, as it were, fit in with them to be able to be experience for us at all. And part of his project as a philosopher, therefore, was to carry out a large-scale investigation into what the nature of these forms was.
Yes.
And if that investigation is successful and complete, it will tell us what the limits of all possible knowledge is. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
And that anything that's outside that is just simply unknowable to us.
Yes. Yes.
Now, the implications of this are absolutely radical, not only for what is included, but for what is left out, aren't they?
That's certainly true and fundamentally true. And I find it hard to believe that it wasn't, so to speak, something of a disappointment to Kant that this is the position he got himself into, because one gets the impression from the way he embarks on his inquiries that he would like to build a sort of firm foundation for theological speculation about God and the soul and metaphysical speculation about the cosmos. Whereas what he actually finishes up doing is saying that there can be no such foundations, because all we can establish foundations for is the notion of possible experience and what can be an object of possible experience. And if you try to go beyond that, if you try to raise questions about how the cosmos should be characterized quite independently of any possible experience, or if you try to talk about God and the soul, then your enterprise must collapse and be in principle vacuous, can't you say so?
Now, Kant thought that it was impossible for us to know whether God exists or not, or whether he has soul or not, but he did himself believe that God did exist and that we do have souls, didn't he?
Yes, indeed.
He was very clear that this was a matter of faith and not something that was knowable.
Yes.
But how on his own premises is talk about God or the soul even intelligible?
Yes. Well, that's a very good question, and one on which he is, I should say, slightly shifty, I think. What he wants to say, and this is rather interesting, it involves him sort of turning the whole issue upside down in a rather interesting way. Because some of his predecessors, at any rate, had made the supposition that our moral convictions and attitudes and our religious convictions stand in need of some kind of metaphysical foundation. And they tried to provide that in the form of theology and philosophical ethics. Well, Kant finishes up putting the thing exactly the other way up. He says that we are not only entitled to moral convictions and religious convictions, he thought it inescapable that we should have them. And these would lead us to essentially metaphysical doctrines about God and the soul, but that those doctrines themselves, if they had any foundation at all, it consisted directly in our primitive moral convictions themselves, so that it's those that are fundamental.